Hi. Thank you for being a part of this conversation with me about terms, about words, about maybe phrases that are important for us to define if we're going to understand God's invitation to fellowship. The word that we're going to be thinking about today is the word sin. Now, one might think that this is a pretty easy word to understand, a pretty easy word to define, and I suppose it probably is if we're just looking at a definition, a raw definition of it. And yet it's important for us to understand what it is that Paul meant when he said that we have all sinned. In another conversation, we'll look at the result of sinning, falling short of the glory of God. But for now, we just want to understand what this word sinned means. So if we go back again to the language in which Paul wrote this letter, we'll discover that the word is actually an archery term. In its simplest form, in its rawest form, the word that we translate sin, and in this case it's the past tense because it's talking about the human condition from Adam and Eve who sinned against God, and every human since then, all have sinned is what the verse says. We find that we're talking about missing the mark. So it's an archery term, I suppose. In today's world, it could be a shooting term. Darts, maybe even. Anything where we have a bullseye or a target that we're trying to hit with something. Or maybe we're playing, well, I guess we don't really play lawn darts anymore, do we? Lawn darts have kind of been outlawed as too dangerous. I don't know what that means. Maybe we're tossing bean bags and playing cornhole. But we have a mark. We have a target. We have concentric circles, and we're trying to hit the middle circle for what we would call a bullseye hit. And the idea is that when we do that, we miss. So if we take this term that Paul used as he is talking about all of us sinning, that's its raw form, that we are missing the mark. But in order to understand the context of it and what exactly he's talking about, what exactly he means, because he's not talking about archery, he's not talking about going to the gun range, he's not talking about playing lawn darts, he's not talking about cornhole, he's not talking about darts. He's talking about behavior and I think also attitudes that shape behavior. The target that is missed by all of us is the standard that God has set for righteousness. So we're getting back to that word righteousness. Put it into the courtroom again and recognize that almost in all cases where somebody is in a courtroom, it's because there is something about a law that is being questioned. Somebody has acted contrary to what the law has said is what must be done or must not be done. And somebody has been accused of breaking that law. And so a judge or a jury needs to decide whether or not that is true, whether or not that is the case, and then also enforce obedience to that law. So we understand this in our culture, that we have laws, and that laws are given to us ultimately for our protection, so that we can live a life in a healthy and effective way within our society, so that either we aren't hurt by the people around us or we don't hurt the people around us. So if we take that idea and expand it into a bigger sense, we find that God has given us law. God's law is not intended to make life miserable. God's law is intended to protect us against our neighbor and to protect our neighbor from us. And I suppose we most clearly find his law written in what we call the Ten Commandments. And this is the standard. And I think as we look through the Ten Commandments, we will find that it's going to cover everything that is about our fellowship with God and our relationship with each other. In our counting of the commandments, the first three have to do with our fellowship with God and the standards that God sets for that. He says to us that he is a jealous God. That is, that he doesn't want competition, and that there are consequences for us if we choose to follow some other God. If we choose to have something in our lives, whether we call it our God or not, that holds priority in our lives above God. And so the first commandment tells us that we should have no other gods. The second commandment then takes us to the authority by which our one God speaks, that is, his name. We have this when we sign a contract, we sign our name, saying that we are putting the value of who we are, and our name is a symbol of that value. And so God says to us that we ought not take his name or use his name in vain, which really has to do with misunderstanding his authority. It has, as we go to the New Testament, has to do with misunderstanding who he is. As we remember that the name of the son that Mary bore was Jesus, which means that God saves. And so ultimately, as we remember God's name, as we keep God's name holy, we remember who he is, we remember his authority in our lives, and we remember his saving grace. The third commandment that God gives to us is to remember the Sabbath, to keep it holy. And in its original setting, God emphasized the importance of this commandment by asking his people, by telling his people that they were to not work on the seventh day of the week. But as we look more fully into that commandment, what we recognize is that for us, this commandment is not about not working on a particular day, though that is important, and it is important that our bodies have rest. We ought not to be workaholics. Our bodies need to rest. And so that is kind of built into this as God's protection, maybe against ourselves. But ultimately what God wants us to do is to rest in what he has done for us. And so we miss the mark when we think that we can work for our salvation, when we can do something to gain God's favor, that we can do something that will make it possible for us to be in fellowship with God. And to honor the Sabbath, to remember the Sabbath, and to keep it holy really is about resting in the work that God completed for us. And then we have 7 commandments about our interaction with each other. We begin by talking about the foundation of society, which is the family, and God calling us as children to honor and obey our parents, and then by extension those who are in authority over us. So actually any time that we purposefully break a law that is a part of how our community operates together, we're breaking this commandment. then God tells us that we need to honor life, that we ought not to murder. Now, there are situations where the taking of life might not be considered murder, but when we wantonly disregard life and take the life of another or endanger someone, cause harm to another, then we are breaking this commandment. God also establishes the boundaries around which human sexuality ought to operate, and whenever we disregard God's ordinance of marriage, then we are breaking the commandment. And when we have sexual relations outside of marriage, we're breaking the commandment. God tells us also that we ought not to steal, that we ought not to take unjustly that which belongs to another. And here he is protecting our neighbor's property and protecting us from our neighbor taking our property. The next commandment really has to do with our reputation. It says that we ought not to bear false witness against our neighbor, that God is protecting our neighbor against slander, against gossip, against our defaming, against our speaking unkindly. And even we often talk about this commandment in terms of lying, and we see that yes, in this commandment, God is calling us not to lie, but also we need to recognize that this commandment is telling us that we don't tell the truth in a way that's harmful. The last two commandments are commandments really of the desire, and they really have to do with selfishness. And the word that we find in both of the commandments is coveting, that we should not covet our neighbor's home, is the 9th commandment. And really what I think this is talking about, as we look at the community to which this commandment was given, they were farmers, they were an agrarian people, and their value within their society was tied to their ownership of land. And God was very particular as he set up the civil laws for the people of Israel, that land was to be passed on within the families, and it was not to be taken out of the families. And any land that was sold out of the family clans, was to be returned to that family every 50 years in the year of Jubilee. So ultimately what we see there is that we're talking about not just one's house, but one's standing in the community and one's means of making a living. And that we ought not to want that which belongs to another in their status in the community. And so he's protecting that. And then finally he is talking about our other relationships and our property. That the commandment specifically says that we ought not to covet our neighbor's wife, but we understand that broadly, that includes both genders, that women ought not to covet their neighbor's husbands, and that men ought to not covet their neighbor's wives. Adultery has already been covered in the earlier commandment, but again, we're talking about the relationships that our neighbor has, and that we ought not to want those same relationships. We can have relationships like them, but not the same ones that our neighbor has. And the same is true with the neighbor's property. And this doesn't mean that, if our neighbor has something that we would like, that we can't offer them a fair value for that property, and that the neighbor could sell that to us. But by wanting the exact thing that our neighbor owns, then we are violating this boundary that God places around how we live together in harmony with our neighbors. And so as we look at these 10 commandments, we see that it really applies to anything that we are about in life, whether it is our fellowship with God or our relationship with the people around us. And what we find is that not only don't we, but we are not able to hit the bullseye. That if these are all the concentric circles on the target, we miss them and we actually can't hit them. That doesn't mean that as we live out our lives, we don't obey, but ultimately it's impossible for us to perfectly obey. And so when we look at Romans 3:23 and understand the reality of humanity, we find that we are all under this condition, that we have all sinned, not because we do bad things or don't do good things, but because we are unable to hit the mark, because we are essentially sinners. As Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2, that we are dead in our trespasses and sin. Fortunately, this is not the only term in our list of vocabulary words. We're going to look next time at the consequences of not hitting the mark. And then as we continue through our vocabulary terms, we're going to also see that God has a solution to this terrible problem in which we find ourselves. So stay tuned and continue to be a part of this conversation as we look at these critical vocabulary terms, God words, I call them, that help us understand God's call to fellowship. God bless you.